What's going on, guys? I just finished the audiobook to Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson, and I wanted to give a Catholic reaction towards it because I think a lot of the Catholics who are commenting on Jordan Peterson and what he's talking about, I don't know how many of them actually read his book. So I just did, so here's my reaction to it. And I also want to clarify that this is just a reaction to it. I don't want to really debate any of his claims per se. I just kind of want to react to some of the points he made and what I think are the points of connect between Catholics and his view of things, and where are the points of tension. So if I had to summarize the book in one word, I would say that Maps of Meaning is about myth. And if you give me two words, I would say it's about true myths. The thesis of the book, as I understand it, is that human beings basically find ourselves in a big world where there's a lot going on, life's complicated, and in order to live in the world, we need to form some ideas of how the world works. And Jordan Peterson tries to illustrate that mythology plays a role in orchestrating the whole process of forming ideas, reinforcing those ideas, or forming new ideas, especially forming new ideas when we're faced with new information. So there's a whole process of mental modeling, of forming ideas about the world, and he basically argues that mythology and symbolic thinking and dreams plays a role in that process. So what I want to do is, first let's talk about the points of tension, and then I'll end off with points of agreement, and then I'll go off a little bit about some of my own thoughts for a minute about Jordan Peterson, because I don't want to make too many videos just about him. So while I'm talking about his book, I'll throw in a point at the end. But so the points of tension between, I think, Catholics and Maps of Meaning, his book. He is a psychologist, and he talks about psychology, and he talks about the role of religion in psychology. So there's a tendency to put religion at the service of psychology. And maybe this is expected, right? So historians might tend to historicalize religion. Psychologists might tend to psychologize religion. Scientists might tend to view religion as a sort of primitive science. So you might expect this from someone who's trying to wrap religion into their field of study or area of expertise. And he definitely does talk about religion, religious language, as a sort of imperfect and symbolic way to navigate psychological space. And he even goes so far as to indicate that one day we might understand our psychology thoroughly enough to graduate from religious and symbolic language. And this is definitely taking things farther than Catholics are comfortable with. So I want to give some examples. I think we can put this point of tension, or these points of tension, into a couple different buckets. And I'll give you a few quotes, a few examples. So first, I think we can first point of tension, first bucket I think we can put these into is the actual existence of religious figures and religious personalities is less important than what they mean. So in other words, I think he tends to put the meaning of religious texts or the meaning of religious figures as more important than whether or not they actually existed. So, for example, I'm just taking this out of chapter 5, he talks about the devil not as a personality or not as an actual entity, but the devil is more like the embodiment of things like a social and spiritual process of rigid beliefs, the rise of totalitarianism, lies, refusal to admit error, the development of hatred for the self and the world, and all these things all at once. And the devil is embodiment of these processes. The devil's not an actual entity necessarily, and that's how he talks about the devil. Again, in chapter 5, talking about the devil, he says we don't have an explicit model of evil that would allow us to dispense with this mythological representation. Another quote, less on the devil side, but more on the good side, the New Testament side. He says that the New Testament traditionally has been read as the description of a historical event, which redeemed mankind once and for all. It might more reasonably be understood as the description of a process that, if enacted, would bring about the establishment of peace on earth. So again, he's saying that the New Testament is not so much about historical events, it's more about describing metaphorically a process, and if we embodied this process, if we acted out its principles, then we would establish peace on earth. Another quote along this line, he says he goes off a lot on about the alchemists and how he doesn't just talk about Christianity, he talks about other religions and other branches of Christianity. He also talks about alchemy and the alchemists, and he said that also in chapter 5 that organized Christianity, and he's quoting, who is he quoting here? I think he's quoting Jung, who said that I should have wrote it down. I got my quotes up here. I didn't write it down. He's quoting someone else who said that organized Christianity had sterilized itself by insisting on the worship of some external truth as means to salvation. The alchemists rediscovered the error of this presumption and came to realize that identification with the Redeemer was in fact necessary, not his worship. That myths of redemption had true power when they were incorporated and acted out, rather than believed in some abstract sense. So there's a lot there. It's kind of dense, and I think someone who has a degree in Catholic theology would really want to sit down and split a lot of those hairs, and I think reject 60% of those words. So another bucket I could put his these tension points into. The first one, again, being the first point of tension, I would say, between Catholics and him is religion seems to be more about the meaning of it rather than the actuality of it, or the literalness of it, you might say. The other bucket we could put this into, which is along the same vein, is religious beliefs. Like, how do we come up with religious beliefs? Where do they come from? What's the origin of the statements that religious people believe in? He doesn't think they're due to revelation. He thinks that they are due to psychology and the evolution of our ideas and our ethics. So one way this comes out is he equates stories of different religions as all having the same meaning. For example, he spends a lot of time explaining the meaning of the deluge or the flood myths, and talks about how the same flood myth shows up in Mesopotamia and like Indian religions. He spends a lot of time talking about how the theme of the tree and the snake, he thinks that the meaning of that story shows up in different cultures, in what he calls the axis mundi, the Scandinavian serpent beneath the world tree. He thinks that the meaning of the tree and the serpent is identical to chakras, and he even sees this in Moby Dick as well. And so he's kind of just saying the meaning of this story is a theme in all of our world literatures, and I think that's the driving point, right? It's these are not due to divine revelation, right? These statements that religious people believe are not due to revelation. They're due to psychology and trying to articulate a psychological process. Again, along these lines, he claims that the Old Testament monotheism has its roots in older, more polytheistic thinking. He quotes Carl Jung to claim that the New Testament Christianity is rooted in Gnostic thought, which, in accordance with psychological laws, had to grow in a time when the classical religions became obsolete. So, first bucket of tension points is the meaning of religious figures, and the meaning of stories is more important than whether or not they happened or whether or not they exist. Second bucket is, our religious beliefs originate due to psychology or psychological process, or this attempt to articulate fuzzy things, not due to revelation. And third, I think I didn't really have a bucket. I just, some other things that are worth pointing out, which are, some quotes that are obvious points of tension between Maps of Meaning and actually religious people. I didn't really have a bucket for these things, but for example, he also says things like, if you're in the business of psychologizing religion and saying that all religions are fundamentally about a psychological process, you're going to say other things like this. So, for example, God the Father represents good things like order and stability, but God the Father also represents things like tyranny and the rejection of change. Evil is the rejection of the process of exploration. That's his definition. He quotes the Gospel of Thomas. He said, this is another thing, again, I'm kind of quoting this out of context, but these are not noises you hear coming out of Catholic mouths. For example, evil fosters God's desire to inundate and destroy everything that exists. That's a quote from his book. Again, a little out of context, but you don't hear religious people talking like this about God. Not Catholics or Christians, at least. Regarding Adam and Eve before they sinned, he talks a lot about Adam and Eve and how Adam and Eve is a metaphor for increasing your self-awareness. And he says that about Adam and Eve, to be unaware of nakedness is to be much less troubled, and also much less. Right? We have this idea in Christianity that sinning is bad, and that Adam and Eve brought sin into the world, and that wasn't a good thing. Here, it's seen as almost an inevitable thing, but it's not a bad thing. It's the process of becoming more self-aware. It's a stressful process, but not a bad one. And we tend to think that it's about sin, but he tends to think of this story as a metaphor for increasing self-awareness. So that's kind of the third bucket of tension points, which is no category in particular, just things that you don't hear coming out of religious mouths, but you hear coming out of Jordan Peterson. So to kind of summarize the tension points, I would say that Jordan Peterson mentions that, this is more of like an example that I think crystallizes the difference between Jordan Peterson and seriously religious people. I would say that here's an example that he gave in his book. He said that he was in school and probably CCD or some religious ed, and they read the story about Satan's fall from heaven. And his reaction was, I didn't know what that story meant. So as I was listening to his audiobook, it struck me as the key point of disconnect between him and, let's say, regular Catholics, right? I think regular Catholics would just take the story at face value, right? The story of Satan falling from heaven. Catholics would just take the story at face value as an event that happened and then move on. And maybe the spiritual meaning of that story would just manifest later in life, and it clicks, and it's like, oh, this story and the meaning of the story makes sense to me, after kind of taking it for granted. Jordan Peterson didn't take it for granted, right? He heard the story, he thinks there must be some meaning to it that he doesn't understand, and he never really takes it on as an event that happened. And I would tend to think that if you don't just internalize the stories, if you if you think that you don't understand them, and then you just kind of forget about them, you're less likely to internalize the meaning later down the road. Whether or not they're true, if they do have a meaning, I would think that you should, if you want to actually get the benefit of the story, I think you should hear it and accept it and internalize it rather than reject it and think about it. I think you're more likely to actually get the benefit of the story if you do it that way. So maybe that's just me rambling. But so those are the tension points. I want to go to the points of agreement, and I really want to pause on this point because I said a lot, and I think I said a lot of things that would disenchant a lot of the Catholics I know from taking him seriously. And I want to pause here because I think the points of agreement are substantial. And I also think that Catholics, we hear a lot of things like that from Jordan Peterson, and we use that to dismiss him as a figure and thereby dismiss the things he says. And so I think before Catholics tap out, I really think we should consider these points of agreement. I think we should chew on these and take them seriously. So the first point of agreement, I think we can sign off on the fundamental thesis of his book. I don't think Catholics would have a problem with that. I'm not going to speak for every theologian in the church, but I think his book explores the importance of religious symbology and religious culture and religious practices in the formation of balanced individuals and balanced societies. So I would think his fundamental thesis is that if you're going to become a heroic individual, religious language and religious culture and religious behaviors and rituals are going to prime you psychologically to be your best self, and ditto for cultures and cultural values. And I think that Catholics can subscribe to that, and I also think that he's presenting it in a way that's more appealing to our culture. And so I unfortunately I think that Catholics are much less appealing in how we present this point. If you think that Christianity or if you think your faith, if you think your Catholicism has something to say with respect to how do you find meaning in life, if you think that Catholicism informs your ethics in a good way, if you think it informs your sense of purpose in a good way, if you think it informs your relationships in a good way, and it does all these things all at once, which is G.K. Chesterton's orthodoxy, we should, that's a great point that I think the culture is able to hear. I think a lot of people are willing to hear that if we are just tactful enough about how we present that, and this is evidenced by the fact that he's getting thousands and millions of views. I think his Psychological of Biblical Stories lecture series right now, last I checked, has 6 million views on the first video, and there's 12 of those videos. So he's presenting this in a smart way and in a relevant way, and I think we can learn from that. And that's before we dismiss everything he's saying as irrelevant or as heretical. I think we need to internalize this point that he's able to bring. He's not afraid to talk to the utility of religion, and I think we're squeamish about that. And I think it's important that we start doing that in a way that's more in line with orthodox thinking. I think that there's so much there to bring to bear that we have to just be better at it, right? So that's what I'm trying to say when I talk about the points of agreement between us and him, right? I don't want us to just put him in a box and dismiss him because he's in that box. I want to take what he's doing seriously because he's successful, and I think we should adopt that. So that's the big point of agreement, is his overall thesis. Another point of agreement, which maybe is less important, but I think what he thinks is that the answer to bad religion, and what I mean by that is sometimes religious people become antisocial due to their twisted perception of their faith. And I've seen this in Catholics, where if you just read books and you don't socialize, if you just read Catholic books and you're not socially calibrated, you can mistakenly make some really abrasive and callous and un-Catholic statements, ironically. So I think that he would say, and what I would say, the answer to bad religion. So if the answer to being in a bubble in such a way that certain antisocial things fester, which I think is a thing. I think he agrees that it's a thing, and I think secular culture gets really hung up about religion on this point, because I think secular perception is that religious people don't correct for this enough. The answer to that is good religion. The answer to that is not getting rid of religion, as many of the new atheists after 9/11 were pointing out. The answer to that is not getting rid of religion. The answer to bad religion is good religion. And I think that's a point he doesn't really make explicitly in his book, but I think he would sign off to that based off reading the book and based off other things I've heard from him. And so I think what I want to say, kind of in closing, about these points of agreement and points of tension is, when I watched Bishop Barron's video on Jordan Peterson, on the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, I think is what he called it, he put Jordan Peterson in the Joseph Campbell box, and what he basically said was, he's presenting, this is Bishop Barron's take on it, he said that Jordan Peterson is presenting things in a smart and relevant way, but just realize he's kind of like Joseph Campbell, who also kind of psychologized or mythologized Christianity. So be cautious, take it with a grain of salt. And I think people who Joseph Campbellize Jordan Peterson are missing out, are using that as an excuse not to think harder about why he's successful and why he's reaching out to people, and how can we adopt those practices, right? So he's really Jordan Peterson is genuinely trying to talk to the goods of religion in a secular world, and that can be an absolute tightrope. And he's aware of this, and he's careful about how he words things. And I think we need to pay attention to and take the lessons learned from that, because he's landing large audiences with popular atheists like Sam Harris or Matt Dillahunty. And again, his lecture series on the Bible got tens of millions of views. Like, when was the last time a Catholic speaker put up a lecture on the Bible and got tens of millions of views, right? Why is Jordan Peterson being the representative of religious people in this way? We should up our game, basically, and we should try and understand how he's reaching people in an effective way, and then adopt that. And so I think before we put him in the Joseph Campbell box, I think we should really pause and try and internalize and understand what's going on here. So those are my reactions to the book itself. Again, I don't want to do a separate video on this. I have an afterword, because I've been thinking about Jordan Peterson versus Sam Harris's definition of truth, and I'm I'm not understanding why people are confused on that, so I'll take a minute or two to inject my thoughts here, because I don't really want to do a separate video for that. So my understanding is, after watching Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris go at it about the definition of truth, I'm not really understanding. I'm a little confused why people are confused about this. So maybe I'm oversimplifying, or maybe I'm missing something. I just want to put this out there. I'm kind of thinking out loud. Jordan Peterson's definition of truth. Jordan Peterson thinks that there's a psychological process that gets us to form concepts. And that process is scaffolded by things like dreams and symbolic processing and values and so on, right? Our process of mental modeling, forming ideas about how the world works, is scaffolded by this process, which right now basically we only have mythological language for. We only have mythological language to address what it's like to experience this. I think that's his basic thesis. So Jordan Peterson simply extends that to the concept of truth itself. In other words, truth itself is a concept. It's a schema that our brains are trying to wrap around, and this process of mental modeling applies to the schema of truth itself. So therefore, our formation of the concept of truth is also subject to these, let's say, mythological and psychological processes. Sam Harris, if I understand correctly, believes that there's an objective truth that's independent of our minds, and we get closer to truth, we get closer to that objective truth if we follow certain psychological and philosophical procedures, and if we enact these procedures correctly, we will get closer to the truth. And these procedures, again, these are not psychological processes, these are a sequence of action steps that we take robotically. Not, we distance ourselves from our subjectivity, and we follow these process procedures which get us closer to objective truth. And so that's an interesting distinction, and there's a big discussion around that should happen, because there's differences there and we should talk about them, but it seems kind of clear to me what the difference is, so maybe I'm missing why they tend to talk past each other so much. So anyway, that's all that's all I got. Those are my 2 cents. Those are my 2 cents on the book, and those are my 2 cents on the debates he's been having, so on the definition of truth. But that's all I got. Thanks for tuning in. No, wrong button.